We're just going to speak about this extraordinary phenomenon of Jews winning the Nobel and why it's so high. So there's a very famous verse in Daniel, and the verse in Daniel says that God gives wisdom to those who are wise. And it sounds like a ridiculous statement. What does it mean you give wisdom to those who are wise? Why do you need to give wisdom to those who are wise? It's one of the noble women in Rome actually asked Rabbi Akiva about this statement. She told him, how could it be that it says that God gives wisdom to those who are wise when they're wise already? And the rabbis commenting on this in the Talmud in Masechet Brachot say, what it means is that when someone appreciates wisdom, when someone has gives value to wisdom, then God places wisdom in them. But if someone doesn't appreciate wisdom, if someone doesn't have the same respect for wisdom, then it's not going to be the same way. And so when building the Mishkan, for example, it says that God gave wisdom again to those who are wise. And the idea is that once a person has an appreciation for wisdom, then you get more wisdom. There's the famous joke about the a Jewish president who's elected to be the president of the United States of America. And they come to their inauguration and their mom is there, and someone tells the mom, and she says, you must be so proud. Your son has become the first Jewish president of the United States of America. And the mom says, you should see my other son. He's a doctor, right? So there is this Jewish idea to valuing wisdom, to respecting wisdom, to appreciating wisdom. And that is something that is very much reflected in the number of Jews winning the Nobel. Famously, the daughter of a Roman emperor came over to one of the greatest rabbis in Israel, and she told him, isn't it a shame? You're one of the most wise people in the world, and look how unattractive you look. Look how you look. You're all disheveled, and it's a shame that God gave wisdom to you. So he asked her, does your father have any wine at home? And she says, yes, of course. He says, where do you store the wine? And she tells him, we have these huge jars that we have the wine in, these old, whether it's wooden or clay jars. He says, don't you think it would be appropriate to have your most expensive and delicious wines in silver or in gold? And she says, yeah, that actually sounds like a good idea. And she takes a bunch of her father's special wines and she puts them in gold and silver. And lo and behold, there is this situation where the wine spoils. And obviously she learns the lessons, she understands the lesson, and that is that not always is wisdom stored with the most beautiful jar. And so the concept of wisdom as being given to those who appreciate it most is all resonating through these centuries. Who was our first wise man in the book of Genesis? Joseph. Joseph is called out of the pit. He's called to speak with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, I hear you're one of the most brilliant people. And what does Joseph say? He says, no, the wisdom is not mine. It comes from God. And so we have this tradition of both having people who value wisdom and at the same time making sure that we approach wisdom humbly. The verse in Deuteronomy famously says, Ubelev kol chacham lev natati chokhmah. In Deuteronomy says, Ushmartem v'asitem, you should keep this Torah, you should keep this wisdom. Ki hi chokhmatchem uvinatchem le'nei kol ha'amim. An extraordinary statement. This is what you will be respected for, and this is the wisdom that you'll have most in front of all the nations. King Solomon, known as the wisest of men, famously, how did he become smart? It's like, the stories with the genie, where the genie is giving you a few wishes. And so when he becomes king, God says, what would you like? And King Solomon says, the only thing that I would like as I become a king of this people is to have extraordinary wisdom, because to be able to judge and make decisions, I need the wisdom. And God says to him, since you have requested wisdom over anything else, I'm going to give you not only wisdom, but also great wealth and a very solid kingdom. And so again, the idea that wisdom above all has echoed through the Jewish centuries, and King Solomon articulates it most strongly in the book of Mishlei. we have a blessing that we make. You know how there's a blessing that you make when you smell something, when you eat something. There's also a blessing you make on special occasions. And the rabbis say that if you see a great Torah scholar or a great scientist, you make a special blessing. So once again, the sanctity of wisdom, of science, of knowledge is enshrined not only in Jewish theory and history, but it's also in Jewish law and practice. In fact, interesting, there's the ancient Greek philosopher in the year 320 BCE comes to visit Israel, and then he and later Greeks described the Jewish people as a nation of philosophers. A nation of philosophers, because philosopher was a form of someone who sits and contemplates, and he never saw such a thing, where even the farmer, the shoemaker, the blacksmith, everyone has an appreciation for wisdom. It's like if you take a cab. Anyone here ever take a cab in Israel? Right? Every single cab driver is a political scientist. Everyone's a commentator. Everyone has opinion. The famous story, I believe it was with Golda Meir, where the American president says to her, "Why are you so stressed out? You have about 2-3 million citizens. I have more than 100 million citizens." And she says, "Well, you have 200 million citizens. I have 2 million presidents. Each one thinks that they're on their own." So the Jewish people are known as a nation of philosophers. So now let's get to the person, the hero of the day, Albert Einstein. I must say that throughout the preparation, something happened to me that I didn't think would happen to me. And that is, there were points that I cried, because there are so many aspects to Albert Einstein and to who he was that get lost in the discussion about him as a great scientist. There are so many things that get lost when we speak about Albert Einstein as a celebrity. He's the first celebrity scientist and probably still the greatest celebrity scientist to this day. Hundreds of books written about him, children's posters, books. And yet in all of that, in him being so famous, sometimes we lose a touch of what his Jewishness was about and what his Jewishness meant to him and to others, and hopefully do some justice with history. Einstein is the ultimate universalist, literally, right? He tells us the secrets of the universe, but he's also the ultimate particular Jew who will not shy away from showing his Jewishness. Unlike many Jewish scientists in his time who were, in his day and age and equals of his in the sense of their upbringing, were not as proud as he was. And so it's just important to speak a bit about that Jewishness. Rabbi Sachs used to always say, non-Jews are proud of Jews who are proud of their Judaism, and non-Jews are embarrassed of Jews who are embarrassed of their Judaism. And that very much embodies what Einstein was, because he really took pride in his Judaism in really difficult situations. And I'm going to show you later really difficult situations, and it's extraordinary. So let's start with his childhood. Albert Einstein is born in the year 1867 in a city called Ulm, Germany. He gets lucky at the age of 5, and he gets sick. He stays home. And while he's home, he's bored. There's no TV or anything like that. And his father buys him a little toy, a compass. And this compass changes the world, because Albert Einstein, as a kid, looks at it and tries to understand what is behind the ability of the compass to always point north. And that's when he starts thinking about big questions like gravity and direction and physics. And really, this gift that he had at the age of 5 really changes everything in terms of who he was. And it's also what distinguishes him as a scientist. Albert Einstein is a combination of both a genius and a simpleton. He's one of the only scientists who explains things to you in parables, in terms that you can easily understand. He's the only scientist who takes tchotchkes, little toys, and he just plays with them. His greatest discovery by far, relativity, was that, does anyone know how it was discovered, when it was discovered? He's driving, I hate to be a spoiler, we're going to see more about this later, but he's riding the bus in Bern, Switzerland, and he's looking at the tower. There's a tower with a clock in the city in Switzerland, and he starts asking himself, what would happen if I, in this bus, would keep my eyes on the clock tower in Bern and then start traveling at the speed of light. And that's where he comes to his discovery about how time would affect him differently in space versus on Earth. And so he's very, on the one hand, he thinks of extraordinarily abstract ideas, some of which are just in science fiction to just this day. But on the other hand, he's very practical. He's very material. Starting at age 5, he's playing with that compass, and that really forms his future. It's very interesting that his religious upbringing. So Einstein's parents were not particularly religious or affiliated or observant. They actually sent him to a Catholic school. But they sent him to a Catholic school, but two interesting things shape his childhood. One is there's a law in Bavaria that says that every single child has to receive religious education in their religion. Now, they were not particularly Orthodox, but they were not Christian. And so Einstein's parents have to hire him sort of a bar mitzvah tutor, a tutor that's going to learn with him. And it's that time that Einstein is actually devoutly religious. He even writes poems about God, and he's a very spiritual child. This is at the age of 10. Einstein is a very spiritual child, and this tutoring makes him, he's almost Orthodox. He's almost there. But interestingly, one of the things that end up taking him off once he already joins, becomes pretty religious, is he starts reading more and more. And it actually has an interesting point. He reads a book of Euclid, the great Greek mathematician, and he reads a work about reconciling science and religion. And he's not convinced, and that's when he loses some of his interest in religion. It's interesting. It's an interesting lesson, because sometimes people try and get into discussions of reconciling certain parts of religion with certain parts of science. And sometimes people will give shallow explanations to really difficult questions. And it's just an example how sometimes a shallow explanation that's not really well-grounded can end up doing more harm than good. And that's what happens in the case of Einstein. He's reading up on things, and he's like, no, this is not a good explanation. And that's when he loses interest. Interestingly, I don't know if any of you have heard of this custom, but in the olden days in yeshivas in Europe, you would not sleep in a dormitory. You would pay a family and you would live with them. This was not only in yeshiva, it was called Essen Tag. It was also in medical school. And so there's a medical student who's living with Einstein's family. They needed the cash. We'll see his father was not the greatest businessman. And the family did go through some financial hardships. And there's a medical student that's living in his house just because he's renting a room from his parents. And this medical student, it's interesting, the name of the student is Max Talmud. And he brings home all these science magazines. And that's also another thing that shapes the childhood of young Albert. And he starts reading these science magazines that belong to the Max Talmud, who's dorming in his house. And that really gets him into religion. So it's just an interesting way to see how religion did affect his upbringing. But in some ways, in most ways, Einstein was much more religious than his parents. And it also shows you another very powerful lesson. Sometimes, just this is a general observation, sometimes people say about Jewish education, well, someone got a Jewish education, but later on they dropped out, they left religion for some time. And a very poignant point is that you never know when Jewish education is gonna hit. You never know when, someone goes to shul, they say, oh, well, he only went Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. You have no idea how that's gonna impact the person. And so this is more of a matter of speculation. I can't point cause and effect in Einstein's life between his Jewish identity and his Jewish education, but clearly the education he received as a child did not have short-term effects, but did have long-term effects. So yes, immediately at the age of 11, 12, he was like, this is not for me, but we'll see that later on in life, it really might have been what dramatically changed his identification and who he is as a Jew. Another thing that Einstein did that other scientists who were more posh and fancy didn't do is he had thought experiments. So like I said, for example, he's riding the bus in Bern and he sees the clock tower and he starts wondering what would happen if he traveled in the speed of light into space. But this wasn't the only time he did it. He would always walk around and have these thought experiments that are very unscientific, meaning he would, ride a bike, walk in the street, and he would always look around and ask himself, what if this happened differently? And in that sense, you have the paradox of Einstein, where he's sometimes less scientific, but that leads him to be so much more brilliant than the conventional scientist. So he's walking around at the age of 16. I don't know if any of you have seen ever someone pacing around deep in thought, but that's what he would do. He would walk outside and he would think to himself, well, what if we did this or that? Not necessarily in front of a book or sketching a paper, but just, doing thought experiments on his own. Due to his family's financial difficulties, the Einstein family, or by the way, as it was pronounced correctly, I guess, it was Einstein. The way they say it in Israel is Einstein. The family leaves Germany. His father sells his business, and they make several moves, and eventually he ends up in Italy and then Switzerland. In Switzerland, Einstein gets accepted to the Polytechnique in Switzerland, and he says they say how Einstein wasn't a great student. He was a great student at what he liked. So he got a terrible grade, I think less than a 50 in French, but that doesn't mean he was bad at math. He just was not great at the things he didn't take interest in. And so in school, there are several of his teachers who make really derisive comments about him. And so much so that he says, if you're ever feeling like you're having a hard day, Albert Einstein says about himself at this time, it would have been better if I wouldn't been born, and I'm just a burden on my family. In fact, Einstein's parents die thinking that he's not really that great. They don't live to what we call, I guess, nachas. They didn't live to see him succeed, and really in those days he wasn't great. And because he didn't take great interest in the subjects that didn't interest him, he doesn't end up getting a great job upon graduation, which is when he famously takes a job as a clerk. He's a bureaucrat. He gets a job in Bern, not as an academic, but as a bureaucrat. I don't want to be condescending, but like a third-rate bureaucrat in a invention, in a patent office. And he's basically, back to the word tchotchkes, and he's reviewing tchotchkes. He's looking at different inventions, and he's seeing if there's anything that's intellectual property and unique about it, and that's what he's doing. But having this good job helped him because he had a lot of free time on his hand, and this is really when he writes his greatest papers. In fact, 1905 is called the Year of Miracles. Why is it called the Year of Miracles? Because this is when Einstein writes 3 of his greatest papers. This is before he gets any advanced recognition. He's a simple guy, but thank God the person who received the papers, the editor of the publication, the scientific publication, recognizes the greatness of it. And this is in 1905 when he comes out with a theory of relativity, with quantum physics and many other things that really changed the world as we know it. In fact, if you want to think about how much Einstein has changed your life, think about things like GPS, space travel, lasers, fiber optic networks. All these things would not exist in our life without Albert Einstein. And so if you really look, it's hard to imagine what this world would look without him. Basically, a lot of the most basic things that we see are based on those theories that he presented in 1905 in the Year of Miracles, which is when he, presented this extraordinary number of papers. So yeah, that's the year of his discovery, and that's when he starts getting more and more international recognition. Interestingly, we say Albert Einstein and the Nobel. Albert Einstein actually got a Nobel in a way that's less than what he deserved, meaning he didn't get the Nobel Prize for one of his biggest discoveries. It was one of his less significant discoveries, and it's one of these that really got him the Nobel. Now, why did I say that there were some times that I cried when I was preparing this lecture? You look at Albert Einstein, and he's very famous. He decides that he does not want to go back to Germany. He remembers the military parades in Germany, and he says to himself, this is not a place I want to be at. He renounces his German citizenship, and he decides he's going to stay in Switzerland. However, the University of Berlin, something called the Kaiser Institute, lures him back to Germany. They say, look, the dream of every scientist. They say, you will have a full-time job, full pay, and you won't have to do anything. You can just sit and do all the research you want. We just want you to be here. And so eventually Einstein returns to Berlin. Meanwhile, Jews in Eastern Europe are being pogromed. The conditions are terrible. And Einstein uses his influence already in 1920 to make sure that Jews from Eastern Europe are getting academic positions in Germany, that they're getting visas, because he wants to help refugees fleeing. We're going to see that throughout his life, Einstein did something extraordinary in trying to make sure that Jews who needed refuge always had that. So that's something he's doing already in as early as 1920. In 1921, and I feel, by the way, very special saying this right here. You're going to hear in a moment why. In 1921, Einstein goes to visit the United States of America, our own United States of America. And it's extraordinary because he's already very famous at this point. And why do I say I feel very special saying this here? Because one of his biggest visits was to the Armory. Has anyone ever heard of the Armory? On 67th Street.
What year was that?
1921. 1921, he comes to the Armory, and he comes together with Chaim Weizmann, his good friend, and he comes to speak there. Now, it looks like a lot of you know what that building looks like, and 8,000 Jews crowd inside to hear Weizmann and maybe Einstein say one sentence, and 3,000 people stand outside. So just imagine what that would look like right here. So by then he's an international celebrity, and everyone wants to see him. People greet him already as he's coming off the boat, and not everyone's happy to see him. Who's not happy to see him? Believe it or not, many in the established American Jewish community were not excited. They considered him, I don't know why, honestly, but they considered him an Ostjud, a Jew of the East, which was the ultimate curse among German Jews. He was a Jew more associated with Eastern Europe, that they considered less acculturated, less assimilated, and they were not happy about it. In fact, Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter, who later became a Supreme Court justice, have this whole exchange that was revealed in 2007, and they are losing their minds over this. They don't know what to do about Einstein, because what they want is an Einstein that's going to come and lecture on physics and speak at universities only on physics. And here he is with Chaim Weizmann speaking about the importance of having a Jewish state. And if you're a Jew that really believes that Jews should assimilate where they are, having the most famous Jewish scientist in the world speaking about building a Jewish state is not exactly with your, it doesn't go with your agenda. Another thing that Einstein does that kind of makes them very uncomfortable is he says, I'll speak on the topic of Zionism and supporting the construction of a university in Jerusalem, the Hebrew University, for free. But if you want me to speak on the topic of science in one of your universities, he charges a modest fee of $15,000, which at the time is the equivalent of $250,000 today. And so Felix Frankfurter and Louis Brandeis look at this and they're like, no, we want to show off his knowledge of physics. And here he is, he's speaking at all the JCCs, he's speaking at the Shoals, the Armory, wherever it is, he's speaking about the importance of supporting Chaim Weizmann's Hebrew University. And when a university asks him to speak about the theory of relativity, he says, no problem for today's $250,000. And so he's kind of a thorn in their side. They don't like it. And let's just say they are not particularly sad when he starts leaving. Now, it's important not to judge them that much, because in the 1930s, you already had 1920s, but 1930s even more, you'll have extraordinary anti-Semitism around the world. So there were definitely many Jews who said, look, what's the point of standing out? What's the point of saying we will go and build a Jewish state in Israel? It's also important to note that this really distinguishes Einstein, because here he is from a German Jewish family with no major Jewish affiliation, no religious affiliation. He doesn't even believe in organized religion. He's a universalist, a pacifist, an anti-nationalist, and yet he's a devout Zionist who believes in the right of the Jewish people to return. In fact, this is a topic that many historians and intellectuals struggle with. How could it be? The man who renounced his German citizenship early, very early, because of the nationalism there, is here running around advocating for a Jewish national home. And so this is kind of part of the Einstein identity paradox, where on the one hand, he's very universal, he's very much a pacifist, he's very much someone who believes that humanity should unite around common good and abandon a lot of nationalism, and at the same time, he fights for a Jewish homeland, and we're going to see how that happens. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is he does not think that Jews should hide their Judaism. He doesn't think it's interesting. On some of his applications, you had to write your nationality or religion. Early in his life, he used to not write anything. He insisted he's not going to write anything because he didn't believe in any kind of nationalism. And yet, as anti-Semitism went up, he started writing always in every application against his wife's best wishes and advice. He started writing that he's Jewish in his applications, specifically because there was a rise in anti-Semitism. I'm not going to quote you here Louis Brandeis's letter when Einstein comes, because it's pretty harsh. But again, let's just say that the establishment was not very, very happy. His next trip is to the land of Israel, his only trip, in fact, to the land of Israel. In 1923, he goes with Weizmann, and the idea is he's fundraising. He wants there to be a medical school and a university in Israel. And he goes with Chaim Weizmann. He visits Herbert Samuel. And I think here's another very important point that brings out who Einstein was. He goes to the Western Wall. And much as I have only good things to say about Albert Einstein, usually, he speaks very sharply against the Orthodox Jews at the Western Wall. He calls them a people with a past but without a future, and he does not spare criticism. So on the one hand, you can say, oh, well, I guess he wasn't very fond of Judaism. But it's important to note that people with his background were not even coming to visit Israel. People with his background were definitely not supporting the establishment of a Hebrew university or the state of Israel. And so while part of the paradox is that Einstein is a proud Jew, but at the same time, yes, he did have his criticisms, and understandably, maybe some people here as well, I don't have this taste, but some people, when they go to Israel, they enjoy Tel Aviv more than Jerusalem, and that's fine. Everyone has their own taste, but Einstein does eventually go to Tel Aviv after his visit in Jerusalem. He famously speaks in Jerusalem on Mount Scopus, and he advocates and successfully fundraises for the establishment of Hebrew University and a medical school in Israel. Interestingly, he goes to visit the different schools in Jerusalem, and he meets with, I think it may be the only Orthodox rabbi I know that he's ever met with, and he meets with Chief Rabbi Kook, the chief rabbi of Israel, and the rabbi sits with him and tells him how the theory of relativity is grounded in Kabbalah. He cites for him sources, Kabbalistic sources, how the theory of relativity and Kabbalah are it's mentioned there. But as you may remember from Einstein's childhood, he's not very fond of reconciling religion and science, but he listens politely, and they even have a letter exchange, and it's just a very beautiful, polite, and friendly exchange between Einstein and Chief Rabbi Kook. It's interesting, he then goes to Tel Aviv, and he says he feels much more comfortable, and he's given an honorary residency. Is that what they call it? Not the key to the city, but he's given, he's an honorary resident of Tel Aviv. And when he's there, by the way, not to insult anyone, but when Einstein is there, he says, I received this honor in New York. I was an honorary resident of New York, but this makes me 10 times happier. So he says he's 10 times happier to receive the same honor in Tel Aviv than he is in New York, and he has a great time. He says the following to the New York Times. He says, speaking about the Hebrew University, he says, "I know of no public event that has given me such pleasure as the proposal to establish a Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The traditional respect for knowledge that Jews maintained intact throughout many centuries of severe hardship has made it particularly painful for us to see so many talented sons of the Jewish people cut off from higher education." And so he's really happy to make sure that Jews who are in mandatory Palestine and Israel receive a Jewish education. The years go by, and Nazism rises in Germany. As that happens, Einstein makes sure he helps Jews flee Nazi Germany. And it's very interesting because when Hitler comes into power, Einstein is in the UK. And he's immediately given a few offers of citizenship. Eventually, he takes up the United States. But as he's going on, he is. This is starting 1933. His mission is really to help people out of Germany. Now, he does this so much so that in his home, some scientists complain, looked like a shelter, meaning everyone who was fleeing was welcome in his home. And this is really, you see, the neshama, the soul of Albert Einstein. I mean, these are stories you would hear about a great rabbi, about Raoul Wallenberg. This is, and this is where I say that the popular Einstein and the Einstein that we know are very different. You won't see in the books about him, in the popular science books about him, that he turned his home into a shelter. You won't see that he literally cheapened his name to make sure that Jews can get out of Germany. It was so common for him to write letters on behalf of refugees that eventually American immigration stopped even valuing the letters because he wrote it to so many. At the time, one of the rules of immigration was you had to have a bank account with $2,000, which in today's terms is about $43,000. And he used every penny that he had, and he just opened as many bank accounts as he could, and he schnorred. He asked others, he would knock on your door at night and say, do you mind? Can you please open a bank account with $2,000 for this person to come? And so in that sense, this is an Einstein that I discovered. It's an Einstein that I didn't know about, and it's an Einstein that is not part of the pop culture. It's an Einstein that's really just a righteous man, and more in the spirit of Raoul Wallenberg than Isaac Newton. It's someone who's extraordinarily compassionate and making sure that Jews can escape Nazi Germany. And so he does this throughout the war, and so much so again that his letters are disregarded. I'll just read for you a quote. While staying in Europe in the final in 1933 in Belgium, some scientists complained that Einstein's temporary home had turned into an asylum for the unfortunate, invaded from morning to night by people who need help. So it almost sounds like he's the office of Hayes or the Joint or something like that, and he's doing everything to help others. And I think that's very moving for someone of such brilliance, of such fame, to throw everything aside and make sure he's there for others. And eventually he ends up going to the United States. And again, just like in 1921, if you want him to speak for the United Jewish Appeal, to help refugees, to help the establishment of the State of Israel, he's there for free. If you want to book him for a scientific talk, it's a sky high price, and he's very hard to reach. So in that way, he just gets extraordinary credit. He would show up to any fundraiser, any event, anything that can help. During these years, he is there. While he's there, he goes famously to Princeton University. Now, just to understand how bad things were at Princeton University at the time, Princeton University had a vote among its students. Who do you think the two most important people in the world are? For 2 years straight, the top two people that students ranked, one was Albert Einstein, the second, Adolf Hitler. The students there was a quota on Jews. It had to be less than 5%. So in a class of 750 men, you would have 25 Jewish students. And so the students there are specifically the greatest living person. They had a survey of greatest living person, and that's what the students there chose, which means that understandably, many Jewish students were afraid to even say that they're Jewish. Jewish life was non-existent, and people hid their Judaism. And here's again where I guess I would call it Einstein the Tzaddik, Einstein the righteous comes out. He helps establish the Jewish Student Union at Princeton University, which at the time is very waspy and not friendly to Jews. And, there's all this discussion. Was Einstein, did he believe in God? How much did he believe in God? What did he believe in? He was the first one not only to establish the Jewish Students' Union, but he attends their Friday night Shabbat service, the first Friday night Shabbat service. So, believe, didn't believe, he's the one who really made sure that Jews felt comfortable being who they are openly. Not only that, during the years of the war, many of the students were sent off with the military to participate in World War II, but those who remained there, he stayed with them, and he does a Passover Seder with them. And he's not lecturing, and he's not doing anything. He's participating in the Seder. He's reading the Haggadah. There's a great interview with one of the students who's still alive, how it was. And that's what he does. He sits with them, and he gives them life. Because imagine being a student on such a hostile campus and being afraid to even say you're Jewish while, Nazism was on the rise in Europe. But it's important to remember, right over here on 85th Street was the headquarters of the German Bund, which had millions of members. It wasn't a foreign concept. It was right here in front of KJ, you had the German Bund. And so he, in the face of that, defies it and establishes a Jewish student union. And so it's just something that's very, very important. And throughout his career, Einstein takes extremely courageous positions. He is not silent, he's not quiet, and he doesn't care to do it. And he says, there's a quote from him, what the individual can do is to give a fine example and have the courage to firmly uphold ethical convictions in a society of cynics. And that's exactly what he did. From Joseph Stalin to Joseph McCarthy, Einstein had no problem denouncing the two of those. He spoke out against the Jim Crow laws in places that it was unpopular, and he spoke up for Jewish life when other more established German Jews or just Jews in America were really uncomfortable for him to be so openly Jewish. Now, one thing that you do see where there's criticism of Einstein is the nuclear bomb. And it's interesting, there's a few misconceptions about that. First, without getting to the decision of, what was behind the American decision to drop a nuclear bomb on Japan, it's important to note the famous letter that was written to President Roosevelt about establishing the Manhattan Project was actually not written by Einstein. It was written by another Jewish scientist, Leo Szilard, and he asked Einstein if he should sign it. If he could sign it. And indeed, Albert Einstein signed it, but he didn't write the letter. He definitely wasn't involved in the bomb aspect of nuclear discovery. And what he did know for a fact is that Germany was working on building a nuclear bomb as well. So knowing what he knew about Germany, he was not going to sit on the sidelines when he knew that that Germany might be getting a nuclear bomb as well. So it's interesting and important to contrast people. Sometimes people today judge people based on different standards of a different time and place. Fritz Haber was a contemporary of Einstein. He even helped, they were close friends. He helped him through Einstein's rocky marital life. And Fritz Haber, in fact, was a Jew who won a Nobel Prize, but I would never speak about him. Why? Because he should have gotten the opposite of a Nobel Prize. He's a Jew who was very close with Einstein, and he converted to Christianity. He was ashamed of his Judaism, and he invented many chemical fertilizers that were used for agriculture. But later, he, in World War I, advocated for using them as chemical warfare. He's the father of modern chemical warfare, which later led Germany to many other atrocities. And so Fritz Haber was a close colleague and friend of Einstein, very close, intimate, personal friend. And so Einstein knew what Germany is capable of, and he's seen, what happened in World War I, and he was not going to let Germany get a nuclear weapon before the war took place. Once the war is over, there's a beautiful story by a rabbi from Jersey City, Rabbi Robert Marcus. Rabbi Robert Marcus arrives in Buchenwald, where there's a young Elie Weisel, but also many, many others, who, by the way, we'll speak about next week, and young Elie Weisel and many, many Jews who are in really terrible situation. And I think more than any discussion of Einstein and science and religion, reading this statement of Einstein about what religion is deeply moving. He wrote to this rabbi. So the rabbis, imagine this rabbi is there and he's taking care of all these kids in Buchenwald who have lost everything. He's looking at families who, not even families, individuals who lost every possible thing. And this Rabbi Robert Marcus from New Jersey writes to Albert Einstein about what do you say to someone who lost this much? What do you say to people who have lost so much? And Einstein writes, a human being is part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts, and his feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. The striving to free oneself from this delusion is the one issue of true religion. And that is the idea that we, when we live sometimes on our own, sometimes we think of ourselves as completely isolated, as separate. And the role of religion is to reconnect us to those around us and to the universe. And I thought that's a beautiful statement by Einstein on what he thought the role of religion was, and also words of comfort that he provided to those who survived the Holocaust, to remember that no matter what happens, they are not isolated completely, and they are still part of a greater good. Finally, in 1945, Albert Einstein writes to his, I guess not a friend, but someone that he might have known, Dr. Belkin in Yeshiva University, who happens to be from the town of Radin, which is a town where my family lived. And he says, I hear that you are talking about the possibility of opening a medical school. And I think that's a great idea. You should go forward with it. And Dr. Belkin has a whole back and forth with him. And he says to him, you know what, we'd like to open a medical school and we would like to name it for you. And indeed, a few years later, they opened the Albert Einstein Medical School. I'm sure everyone heard about it in the Bronx. And this was also very much inspired, enabled, and pushed forward by Albert Einstein. Now, another irony is that considering how some of his early relationship with Louis Brandeis was, Albert Einstein in 1946 pushes for the establishment of another Jewish university, the Brandeis University. And the idea was that universities had quotas against Jews, very harsh quotas, and many Jewish students were embarrassed to say that they are Jewish. And so the idea was to have these schools that would have no quotas against Jews. They would be equal opportunity places for Jews as well. And obviously they would accept others too. And so it's important to understand that much of our life in America as Jews has been shaped by Albert Einstein. A lot of people say, oh, well, American Jewry was only able to live as proud Jews after this happened or that happened. This rabbi came, that rabbi came. It's important to note that Albert Einstein, even though he had no religious affiliation whatsoever, was at the forefront of making sure that American Jews and Jews around the world can live proudly and openly as Jews. And he didn't care what it would cost him. He didn't care that none of his colleagues were behaving the way he behaved. He just cared to do what is right, and he was there for every Jew. He was there to fight for every single Jew in ways that sometimes are reserved to those who we regard as righteous, as Raoul Wallenbergs, as great rabbis. But he had that side. He had that side of just letting schleppers and refugees crash his couch, live in his house, and he would open for bank accounts for people and whatever it may be. And he was there. So one final episode in his life, actually two, is that in 1953, when Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, and his close friend died, David Ben-Gurion invited him to be the president of Israel, and he declined. But it obviously spoke to the strong connection between him and the state of Israel. And it's also interesting that when he went to the hospital in his final moments, what he was holding with him was a speech that he was supposed to give in Israel on Israel's 7th day of independence, and that all of his archives, the Albert Einstein archives, look at this extraordinary scientist, one of the greatest scientists in human history. All of his archives are in Jerusalem in the Hebrew University. They're all there, and you just see this unbelievable balance between someone who was so absolutely universal, so humanistic, and so at the same time caring and dedicated to his people. On the one hand, there were sides of him that were very cold and scientific, but on the other hand, you just see his sitting there for the Seder, for Passover, with the Jewish students in Princeton, coming for a Friday night Shabbat service. You just see the Jewish heart that's in him, bubbling and there for everyone. So before we end off, if anyone wants to ask a question, I see if someone wants to ask in the chat, or if anyone has a question or a comment. Yeah. Early, he got it in 1921, and ironically, he had some his family life was not as exemplary as other things. And one of the things he told his first wife, Mileva, is that in their settlement, he said, I will get the Nobel Prize and I will give it to you. So that was one of the things, but he got it pretty early on, and he didn't get it for what he deserved it for. He got it for, he deserved it, but it was one of his less significant discoveries. But his friend who invented a lot of chemical warfare also got it. So in the case of Einstein, I would say the Nobel was even a downgrade, because it didn't recognize him for his true greatness, and at the time it was given also to others who should not have gotten it. Now, very interesting question I got here is what were his learning difficulties? So like I said, Einstein's learning difficulties were that if it wasn't his topic, he didn't really care to put much effort in it. And it's interesting, a very important lesson about delegation. A lot of the calculations that Einstein needed on the way to his discovery, he outsourced. He said, I'm not great with this type of math. Why don't I have a graduate student or someone who's working here do it? This physical experiment, or famously the one of watching a solar eclipse, I'll have someone else do that. He knew what he was good at, and he knew what he wasn't good at. But I can't diagnose him specifically, but he knew what he didn't want to do. And he was laser focused, which is an appropriate statement, I guess, for someone who led to the invention of the laser. A beautiful quote here I'm getting is Einstein said, "My relationship to the Jewish people has become my strongest human tie," and that's true. And interestingly, he said it on his first visit to New York. On his first visit to the United States, he said he's come to love Americans, but he's also come to love the Jewish people. So I think as a community, we can definitely take some credit for that and for his renewed kinship to the Jewish people. But yes, that's something that he said. All right, so I'd like to, yeah?
Did he have children, and what did they achieve?
So he, like I said, I don't want to elaborate on this too much, because I would say this was probably his weakest point. But in terms of being a family man, he did not excel. And he had 2 marriages, and he had children from each. But one of his sons, whose name was also Albert Einstein, later became a professor in the United States, and he was not close with him. Yeah.
Do we know if later in life he became religious?
There's a very beautiful picture of him with a very big yarmulke playing the organ in some. He was also he was a great musician. He was really a great musician. So and he loved playing music. So there's a picture of him playing the organ with this huge black yarmulke in a Reform temple, but he didn't believe in organized religion. So on the one hand, you can say, well, he wasn't that religious. On the other hand, you have to see what his cohort looked like. So other people who were in his situation had his upbringing, lived in his social circles, had his circumstances, did not come even close in terms of his care, love for the Jewish people and what he did for the Jewish people. So yeah, could have he, gone to shul 3 times a day and, have all these Shabbat meals? Maybe, but it wasn't even in his cohort.
I meant more a belief in God and in God creating this universe.
You know what? That's a great question. I thought of it a lot, especially as a rabbi speaking about Einstein. I think the question of whether Einstein believed in God is not a question for Jews, and I'll explain why. We don't ask if Raoul Wallenberg believed in God, right? You know Raoul Wallenberg, who saved many Jews? We don't ask that. You know why? Because it doesn't matter. Because he saved those lives. And I think that Albert Einstein, yes, it's a big question, and everyone tries to claim him. And there's this in the general space, there's this whole debate. Did he believe in, and he wrote specifically what he believed in. He was more of, he believed in the ways of Spinoza, and he believed in he definitely, it's funny. He said there was a debate during his lifetime if he's believing in God or not. He said, between the two groups, I'd rather not be called an atheist. So it wasn't clear where he fell, but he said, please don't call me an atheist. So he himself probably didn't know exactly where to place himself just because he was so complex, but he definitely did not want to be called an atheist. At the same time, again, is it for us to decide, his religious beliefs, his practice? I think that in terms of his heart for the Jewish people, his care for Jewish life, for Jews living openly, it's that I think is what matters most. Yeah, he was so close. He didn't like organized religion. He didn't even like nationalism, countries. He renounced his he wasn't into particularism and just like these organized groups. So that's he was and he had close relationships.
Yeah, the Maria Finkel, Rabbi Emmanuel.
Yeah.
They were all very good friends. They went to Princeton. They went out driving together. Because I've seen pictures of Maria on Marshall's house. Yeah. So look, there are others. Whether it's Felix Frankfurter or Brandeis, who probably would not be seen within a mile of some rabbis, and he didn't have that problem. So did he go to shul? No. But did he sit at Passover, Sidarim, and at Shabbat dinners? Yes. So that's a story. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us online and here. And God willing, next week we'll be speaking about Elie Weisel, also a Nobel Laureate who changed a lot in this world. Thank you everyone for listening, and see you next week.